I should have left when I still could. The music was too loud, too bright, too happy for a night that didn't belong to me. And I remember sitting there at table 17, fingers wrapped around a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching strangers celebrate a love story that felt like it came from a different universe than mine. My heels already off under the chair, because 10 hours on my feet earlier that day had drained whatever energy I had left, and my son, Noah, curled up asleep beside me in a borrowed jacket, his small breaths steady, innocent, untouched by the quiet weight I carried in my chest. And I kept telling myself I would leave in 5 minutes, just 5. After I found my purse, after I said a polite goodbye, after I stopped pretending I belonged in a room full of polished smiles and tailored suits and conversations about vacations I couldn't afford. And that's when I felt it, not a touch, not a sound, just a shift in the air, like something, or someone, had decided to notice me. And I looked up without meaning to, my eyes meeting his across the room. And everything slowed in a way I still can't explain, because he wasn't smiling, wasn't laughing, wasn't even pretending to enjoy the wedding like everyone else. He just stood there in a black suit that looked like it had been made specifically for him. Perfectly still, perfectly composed, like the chaos of the room didn't apply to him, like he existed above it, outside it. And yet somehow, his attention was fixed on me, not curious, not flirtatious, just certain. Like he already knew something I didn't. And I should have looked away. I know I should have. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not when something in my chest tightened in a way that felt dangerously close to recognition, even though I had never seen him before in my life. And then he moved. Not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Each step cutting through the crowd like the room itself made space for him. Conversations lowering, people shifting without realizing why. And by the time I fully processed what was happening, he was already standing at my table, close enough that I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the calm in his eyes, the kind of calm that didn't come from peace but from control. And he didn't ask if the seat was taken, didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a polite excuse. He just pulled the chair across from me and sat down like it had always been his place, like I had been the one intruding. And for a second, I forgot how to breathe, my fingers tightening around the glass as my mind scrambled for something normal to say, something safe, but nothing came, because nothing about him felt safe. And yet, somehow, I didn't feel threatened either, which made it worse, because fear would have been easier to understand than whatever this was. And he leaned slightly forward, his voice low enough that it didn't carry past the table, controlled, steady, like every word had already been decided before he spoke. Dance with me. And I blinked, caught off guard, my first instinct rising up fast and sharp. I can't, I said, shaking my head, glancing at Noah, at the room, at every possible excuse I could find. I'm leaving. But he didn't argue, didn't insist, didn't even react the way most men would to rejection. Instead, he simply stood, stepped closer, and then, just enough for only me to hear, he leaned in, his voice softer now, almost gentle, but carrying something underneath it that made my heart skip in a way I couldn't control. Be my wife, just for one dance. And I swear, in that moment, the music faded, the room disappeared, and every instinct I had ever trusted told me the same thing at once, that saying yes would change everything. And somehow, without fully understanding why, I found myself standing anyway. His hand found mine before I could change my mind. Warm, steady, certain, and I realized too late that I had already stepped into something I did not understand, because the moment our fingers touched, the noise of the room seemed to fall away, not completely, but enough that I could hear my own heartbeat louder than the music, louder than the laughter, louder than reason. And he did not pull me, did not rush me. He simply guided, like he already knew I would follow. And somehow, I did one step, then another, my heels forgotten under the table, my son still asleep behind me, and a sharp flicker of guilt rose in my chest, but it was drowned just as quickly by something else, something unfamiliar and dangerous, the feeling of being seen in a way I had not felt in years. And when we reached the dance floor, people moved without being asked, creating space, subtle but unmistakable, like an invisible line had been drawn around us. And that was the first moment I realized this was not just a man asking for a dance. This was a man the room adjusted for, and his hand settled at my waist, firm but controlled, not crossing any line, just enough to anchor me there, just enough to make it impossible to pretend this was casual. And I placed my hand on his shoulder, aware of the strength beneath the fabric of his suit, aware of how out of place I must have looked next to him. A tired single mother in a dress I had worn too many times, standing with someone who looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine I could never afford. And the music shifted into something slower, softer, and he moved with it effortlessly, guiding me into rhythm. Before I could overthink it, before I could step away, and I stumbled once, just slightly, but his grip adjusted instantly, steadying me without a word, like he had expected it, like he was already compensating for every uncertainty I carried. And that was when it hit me, the quiet realization that I was not leading any part of this, that I was being moved through a moment he had already decided. And it should have scared me more than it did, but instead, I felt something else, something unsettling and strangely comforting, like being held in a current that knew exactly where it was going. And I looked up at him, really looked this time, and his expression had not changed, still calm, still controlled. But there was something in his eyes now, something focused entirely on me, not the room, not the people watching, just me, like I was the only variable he had not fully calculated yet. And my voice came out quieter than I intended, almost lost between us. Why me? And for a second, I thought he might ignore the question, but then his gaze softened, just slightly, just enough that I wondered if I had imagined it. And he leaned closer, not enough to be inappropriate, just enough that I could hear him clearly over the music. Because you are the only one here who does not belong to anyone. And the words landed heavier than they should have, heavier than a simple answer. And I felt my chest tighten again, because he was right, painfully right. I had spent so long being invisible, being overlooked, being just another face in the background of someone else's story, and yet here I was, at the center of his attention, and I did not know whether to step back or lean in, and before I could decide, I noticed it, the shift in the room, subtle but unmistakable, a tension threading through the air like a quiet warning, and his hand at my waist tightened just a fraction. Not enough to hurt, just enough to signal awareness, and his eyes flicked past me for the briefest second before returning, sharper now, colder, like something had entered the space that required his attention. And for the first time since he approached me, I felt it, not fear exactly, but the understanding that whatever world he came from had just brushed against mine, and I was already standing too close to the edge. His hand did not leave my waist, but everything about him changed. So subtle that no one else would have noticed, but I felt it instantly. The way his fingers held just a little firmer, the way his posture shifted without moving, like a line had been drawn and he had decided exactly where I stood in relation to it. And my breath caught as I followed his gaze over his shoulder, trying to understand what he had seen. But all I could make out were guests in expensive clothes, laughter that now sounded slightly forced, smiles that did not quite reach the eyes. And yet something beneath it all felt wrong, like a perfectly staged picture with one detail out of place. And I turned back to him, my voice barely steady. What is it? And he did not answer right away, his eyes scanning the room again, calculating, measuring, deciding. And then he looked down at me, and whatever he had seen, whatever had triggered that shift, he chose not to share it, not fully. Nothing you need to worry about, he said quietly. But there was something in his tone that made it clear that was not entirely true, and before I could press further, his hand moved slightly, guiding me closer, closing the space between us just enough that from the outside, we looked exactly like what he had said, like a couple sharing a quiet moment on the dance floor, and my heart started to race again, not from fear this time, but from the realization that I was part of something I did not understand, something he was controlling with every small movement, every glance, every word, and I became painfully aware of the eyes around us, not obvious, not staring, but watching, noticing, and I wondered if they were looking at me or at him. And then I heard it, a voice behind us, smooth, polite, but carrying an edge that made my shoulders tense. I did not expect to see you here tonight. And his hand tightened just slightly again, not enough to alarm, just enough to ground. And he did not turn immediately, did not rush to acknowledge the voice. Instead, he finished the step, completed the movement of the dance like nothing had interrupted us, like he refused to let anyone else dictate the rhythm. And only then did he glance over his shoulder, his expression returning to that calm, controlled mask. "Plans change," he replied, his tone even, almost casual, but I could feel the difference. The way the air between them carried something unspoken, something that did not belong at a wedding, and I resisted the urge to look back, to meet the eyes of whoever stood there, because every instinct told me that drawing attention to myself right now would be a mistake, and instead I focused on him, on the steady rise and fall of his chest, on the way his presence seemed to anchor everything around us. And for the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. I was not just dancing with a man, I was standing beside someone who existed in a world where conversations had layers, where silence meant more than words, where a single look could carry more weight than an entire sentence. And I was already part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. And then his attention shifted back to me completely, as if the interruption had been dismissed, handled, filed away, and his voice dropped again, softer now, almost reassuring. "Stay close," he said. And the words should have sounded simple, harmless even, but something about the way he said them made my chest tighten again, because it did not feel like a suggestion, it felt like a boundary, a quiet instruction wrapped in calm, and before I could respond, before I could decide whether to question it or ignore it, the music slowed further, the dance coming to its natural end, and his hand did not immediately leave me, did not release me the way it should have, and I realized then, with a clarity that made my pulse quicken, that this moment was not ending the way I expected, that whatever had started with one dance was not going to stay contained to the floor, and when he finally spoke again, his voice low, certain, it carried a promise I did not know how to escape. "You are safer with me than anywhere else in this room." The words should have comforted me, but they did not completely, because safety had never sounded like that before, not steady and absolute, not spoken like a fact instead of a promise, and for a second I just stood there, caught between the instinct to pull away and the strange pull to stay exactly where I was, and my eyes drifted past him toward my table, toward Noah, still asleep, still unaware, his small frame curled under the oversized jacket like the world had not shifted in the last few minutes, and a sharp clarity cut through everything else. I should go back to him. I should leave. I should end this before it became something I could not control, and I took a small step back, testing the space between us. "I need to check on my son," I said, my voice quieter now, but firmer, grounding myself in something real, something that belonged to my life before this moment, and for the first time since he approached me. He did not immediately guide me, did not move with me, he simply watched, his gaze steady, measuring, as if recalculating something. And then he nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate. "Of course," he said, and just like that, his hand left my waist, the absence of it more noticeable than the contact had been, and I turned quickly, almost too quickly, weaving through the edge of the dance floor back toward the table, my heartbeat uneven, my thoughts louder than the music again, and when I reached Noah, I knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, grounding myself in the warmth of his skin, in the quiet rhythm of his breathing, in the simple truth that this was my world, this was what mattered, and yet, even as I focused on him, I could still feel it, the awareness of being watched, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt certain, like distance did not change. Anything, like stepping away had not actually removed me from whatever I had stepped into, and I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to think clearly. I would gather my things, wake Noah gently, and leave. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic. Just walk out, and let this night become something I would eventually forget. Just another strange moment in a life already full of them. And I reached for my purse, slipping my shoes back on, steadying myself. And that was when a shadow fell across the table. Not his, someone else. And I looked up instinctively, meeting the gaze of a man I did not recognize, his smile polite, almost friendly, but his eyes holding something that made my stomach tighten. "You left the dance early," he said, his tone light, but pointed in a way I could not quite explain, and I straightened slightly, instinctively protective, one hand resting lightly on Noah's shoulder. "I needed to check on my son," I replied, keeping my voice even, careful, and his gaze flicked, briefly to Noah, then back to me, and for a moment, his expression shifted, something sharper slipping through before it was smoothed over again. "Of course," he said, nodding. But the word felt less like agreement and more like acknowledgement of something else entirely. And I had the distinct, unsettling feeling that this conversation was not as simple as it appeared, that I was being placed somewhere in a situation I did not understand, and before I could decide how to respond, before I could excuse myself and leave, I felt it again, that shift in the air, that quiet recalibration, and I did not need to turn to know he was there, because the man in front of me straightened almost imperceptibly, his posture changing in a way that made everything suddenly clearer, and when I did look up, Sebastian Cross was standing just behind him, close enough that his presence filled the space without a single word, and his voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, leaving no room for confusion. "She is with me." And the man in front of me held his gaze for a second too long, something silent passing between them, something I could not hear but could definitely feel. And then, just as smoothly as he had appeared, he stepped back, offering a small, respectful nod before walking away. And I sat there, my hand still resting on my son, my heart still racing, realizing with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore that this was no longer just a conversation, no longer just a dance. And when Sebastian's attention returned to me, softer now, but no less certain, I understood something I could not undo. I had not just been noticed tonight. I had been claimed in a way that the world around him already understood. I did not speak right away, because something in the way he stood there made words feel unnecessary, like the room itself had already accepted what he had said, like everyone understood something I was still trying to catch up to. And I slowly looked from him to the space where the other man had been, now empty, as if he had never been there at all, and then back to Sebastian, my pulse still uneven, my hand instinctively brushing over Noah's shoulder again, just to remind myself that I was still grounded, still in control of something. And his gaze softened slightly when it followed that movement, not weak, not distracted, just aware, as if he had already taken note of the most important part of my world without needing it explained. And he stepped closer, not invading, not forcing, just enough that his presence felt intentional again. "Is he yours?" he asked quietly, his voice lower now, almost careful. And I nodded, my throat tight for reasons I could not quite name. "Yes," I said. And for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, something quieter, something that looked almost like respect, before it was gone again, replaced by that same calm certainty that seemed to define everything about him. And he glanced around the room once more, quicker this time, sharper, like he was confirming something, and then his attention returned fully to me. "You are leaving," he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion he had already reached, and I hesitated, because I had planned to, because that had been my decision before everything changed. But now the idea of simply walking out felt different, heavier, like stepping away from something unfinished, something that might not let me leave so easily. And I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. "I should," I replied, choosing my words carefully, and he held my gaze for a second longer, searching, or maybe deciding. And then he nodded once, decisive, final. "Then I will walk you out." And the way he said it made it clear that this was not an offer, not exactly, but it also was not something I felt the need to refuse. Not when the memory of that other man's eyes was still fresh in my mind. Not when the air in the room still carried that subtle tension I could not explain. And I stood slowly, gathering my purse, slipping it over my shoulder. Then carefully lifting Noah into my arms, his small weight settling against me as he stirred slightly, but did not wake, his head resting against my shoulder like he had done 100 times before. And for a moment, everything felt normal again. Just a tired mother leaving a long night. Just another quiet exit. But when I looked up, Sebastian was already there, one step ahead, clearing a path without a word. His presence alone enough to shift people aside without question, without hesitation. And I followed, my steps slower, more cautious, aware of every glance, every subtle movement around us. And the closer we moved toward the exit, the more I felt it, that invisible line tightening, like the space behind us was no longer accessible in the same way. Like leaving was not just walking out a door, but crossing something I could not see. And when we finally reached the edge of the room, the noise fading behind us, the music muffled by distance, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, and he paused, just briefly, turning to face me fully for the first time since we started walking, his eyes steady, unreadable, but focused entirely on me, and his voice, when he spoke again, was softer than before, but no less certain. From this moment on, you do not walk alone. And the words settled in the space between us, heavier than they should have been, heavier than something said to a stranger, and I felt that same pull again, that same quiet shift in everything I thought I understood, because I knew, deep down, that whatever this was, whatever had started with one dance, it was not ending at the door. The cool night air hit my skin the moment the doors opened, sharp and clean compared to the heavy warmth inside. And for the first time since he had approached me, I felt something close to clarity, like stepping outside should have broken whatever invisible thread had wrapped itself around me. But it did not, because even out here, under the soft glow of the parking lot lights, with the distant hum of traffic and the quiet rustle of trees, his presence remained just as strong, just as steady, like the world had simply shifted with us instead of resetting. And I adjusted Noah slightly in my arms, his weight settling more comfortably against my shoulder as he stirred, letting out a small, sleepy sigh that grounded me in a way nothing else could, and I focused on that, on the familiar rhythm of being needed, of being responsible for something real, something simple, and I turned toward him, finally allowing myself to speak the question that had been building since the moment he sat at my table. Why are you doing this? And my voice came out quieter than I expected, not afraid, but searching, trying to understand something that refused to fit into the logic of my life. And he did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting briefly past me, scanning the nearly empty lot, the parked cars, the shadows between them, not nervous, not uncertain, just aware in a way that felt practiced. And then he looked back at me, and for a moment, the intensity softened, just enough to make his next words feel more personal than anything he had said before. Because you stepped into something tonight, he said, his tone even, controlled, but not distant. And whether you realized it or not, it noticed you. And a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the air, because the way he said it made it sound less like a possibility and more like a certainty. And I tightened my hold on Noah instinctively, my mind racing, trying to connect pieces I did not fully have. I do not understand, I admitted, and he nodded slightly, like he had expected that, like confusion was part of the equation he had already accounted for, and he took one step closer, not invading, just closing the space enough that his voice did not need to rise. You do not have to, he said quietly. You just need to trust that leaving alone tonight would not have been wise, and something in the way he said it made arguing feel pointless, not because I believed him completely, but because a part of me already sensed the truth in it, the same part that had noticed the shift in the room, the tension in the air, the way people had reacted to him without words. And I exhaled slowly, my thoughts pulling in two directions at once, one urging me to walk away, to get in my car and drive until this night felt distant and unreal, the other, reminding me that I did not even know what I would be walking away from. And before I could decide which instinct to follow, headlights swept briefly across the lot, a car turning into the entrance, its movement slow, deliberate, and I felt it again, that subtle tightening in the space around us. And his attention shifted instantly, not dramatically, just enough that I knew he had noticed it too, and his posture changed, barely, but enough to signal that something had just entered his awareness. And then his focus returned to me, sharper now, more certain. Where is your car? He asked, and I hesitated for half a second before nodding toward the far end of the lot. Over there. And without another word, he stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself just enough that I found myself naturally moving with him, walking in that direction without questioning it. And with each step, the distance between us and the entrance grew, the sounds of the wedding fading completely behind us, leaving only the quiet of the night and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. And I realized, with a clarity that settled deep in my chest, that whatever had started inside that room had followed me out here, and whether I understood it or not, I was no longer just leaving a wedding. I was being escorted out of something I could not see. And when he finally spoke again, his voice low but certain, it carried a weight that made everything else fall silent. Tonight was not an accident. His words settled into me in a way I could not shake, not loud, not forceful, just undeniable, like something had quietly locked into place, and I slowed my steps without meaning to, my mind trying to catch up to the weight of what he had just said. Not an accident. I repeated under my breath, the phrase unfamiliar and heavy, and he did not correct me, did not soften it. He simply walked beside me, matching my pace exactly, close enough that I could feel the steady presence of him without him ever touching me again. And somehow that distance felt more deliberate than any contact had. And I looked ahead at my car, parked under a flickering light at the far edge of the lot, and for a moment, it felt like a finish line, like reaching it would restore everything to normal. But the closer we got, the less certain that feeling became, and I shifted Noah slightly again, pressing him closer as he stirred, his small hand curling into the fabric of my dress like he was anchoring himself. Without waking, and the simple gesture grounded me, reminded me who I was before tonight, before the dance, before him, and I drew in a breath, steadying myself. "You talk like something is going to happen," I said, my voice low but steady, not accusing, just searching for something real to hold on to. And this time, he did not look away, did not scan the lot. His attention stayed on me completely, and there was no hesitation when he answered. Something already did, and the certainty in his voice made my chest tighten again, because he was not speaking in hypotheticals, not warning about a possibility, but acknowledging a change that had already taken place. And I shook my head slightly, trying to make sense of it, trying to push back against the pull of his words. "I just came to a wedding," I said, the simplicity of it sounding almost fragile now. And for the first time, something like a faint shadow of a smile touched his expression, not amusement, not mockery, just a quiet recognition of how far apart our perspectives were. "And you left as something else," he replied, and the words lingered between us, unanswered, because I did not know what to say to that, did not know how to define what he meant. And we reached my car then, the familiar shape of it suddenly both comforting and insufficient, like it belonged to a version of my life that had shifted without asking permission, and I moved to unlock it, balancing Noah carefully. As I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against my keys, grounding myself in the normalcy of the motion, and when the car clicked open, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, stepping closer to the passenger side, ready to settle Noah in, ready to leave, to put distance between me and everything that did not make sense. And yet, I hesitated, just for a second, my hand resting on the door handle, because something in me knew that leaving did not mean ending, not this time, not with him standing just a few feet away. And I turned back to him, needing something, a reason, an explanation, anything that made this feel less like a story I had been pulled into without consent. "What happens now?" I asked, and my voice was quieter again, not because I was afraid, but because the answer felt like it would matter more than I was ready for. And he stepped closer then, just one step, enough to close the space without overwhelming it, his gaze steady, unwavering, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a finality that made my heart beat slow instead of race, like it was bracing for something instead of reacting to it. "Now," he said, "you go home." And for a brief second, relief flickered through me. Simple, immediate, but it did not last, because he continued, his tone unchanged, his certainty unshaken. "And tomorrow, everything will feel the same." And he paused, just long enough for the words to settle before adding the part that made my chest tighten all over again. "Except it will not be." And I stood there, keys in my hand, my son in my arms, the night stretching quietly around us, realizing that whatever line I had crossed tonight, it was not one I could step back over. And as I opened the car door, his final words followed me in a way I knew would not fade with distance. "I will find you." I did not respond to his last words, not because I did not hear them, but because something in me knew that answering would make it real in a way I was not ready for. And instead I focused on the small, familiar motions that had always grounded me, gently lowering Noah into the back seat, adjusting the jacket around him, buckling him in with careful hands that did not shake even though everything inside me felt unsettled. And he stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open just enough to find me. "Mom," he mumbled softly, his voice thick with sleep, and I leaned in, brushing my fingers through his hair. "It is okay, sweetheart, go back to sleep," I whispered, and he trusted me the way children do, without question, his eyes closing again as if nothing in the world had changed, And for a moment, I envied that simplicity, that ability to rest in certainty, because when I straightened and closed the door, the quiet click sounded louder than it should have, like a boundary being set that I did not fully understand. And I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my hand resting against the car, feeling the cool metal under my palm, grounding myself in something solid, something predictable. And then I turned back to him, still standing exactly where I had left him, not impatient, not waiting in a way that demanded anything, just present, like time moved differently around him. And I forced myself to meet his gaze, to hold it, even though part of me wanted to look away, to break whatever connection had formed. You say things like you already know what is going to happen, I said, my voice steadier now, quieter but more certain, because I needed something, some kind of truth I could hold on to when I drove away from here. And he did not deny it, did not deflect. He simply regarded me for a moment, as if weighing how much to say. And then he took one slow step closer, stopping just short of the space that would have felt too close. And his voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried something deeper now, something that felt less like control and more like inevitability. I know how patterns work, he said. And tonight, you became part of one. And the words settled into me in a way that made my breath catch, because they did not sound dramatic, did not sound exaggerated. They sounded like a fact he had already accepted, and I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against it. I am not part of anything, I said, almost more to myself than to him. And for a second, there was silence between us, not empty, not awkward, just full, like something unspoken was waiting to be acknowledged. And then he looked at me in a way that felt different from before, not assessing, not calculating, just certain. You are, he said quietly. You just have not seen it yet. And I swallowed, my grip tightening slightly around my keys, because I did not know how to argue with something I could not see. And for the first time since this began, I felt a flicker of something that was not fear, not confusion, but awareness, the sense that this was not a moment I could simply leave behind, that whatever he meant, whatever world he was part of, it had already brushed against mine in a way that would not fade overnight. And I took a step back, opening the driver's door, needing distance even if it was only physical, needing the illusion of control. And before I got in, I hesitated, my hand resting on the door as I looked at him one last time, because something in me needed to say it, needed to draw a line, even if I was not sure it would hold. Do not follow me, I said, the words firm, clearer than anything I had said all night. And he did not react the way I expected, did not smile, did not argue, did not dismiss it. He simply held my gaze, steady, unwavering, and then gave a single, small nod, as if acknowledging the request without agreeing to the boundary behind it. And his voice, when he answered, was soft, but carried the same quiet certainty that had followed me since the dance floor. I do not need to, he said, and something in the way he said it made my chest tighten all over again, because it did not feel like reassurance. It felt like a promise I did not yet understand. And as I finally slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, the world outside muffled, separated by glass and distance, I realized with a clarity that settled deep in my chest that leaving this parking lot would not mean leaving him behind. And as I started the engine, his presence lingered in a way I knew would follow me long after I drove away. The engine hummed to life beneath my hands, a low, familiar vibration that should have felt reassuring, but it did not tonight, because as I pulled out of the parking space, my eyes caught him one last time in the rearview mirror, standing exactly where I had left him, still, composed, like he had never needed to move at all. And for a second, the distance between us felt unreal, like it did not matter how many feet, how many miles I put between us, something about him had already closed that gap in a way I could not explain. And I forced myself to look forward, to focus on the road ahead, the dark stretch of asphalt lit by scattered streetlights, the quiet hum of late-night traffic, the normal rhythm of leaving somewhere behind. And I drove, steady at first, then faster than I probably should have, as if speed alone could create distance from everything that had just happened. And Noah shifted softly in the back seat, his small voice breaking through the noise in my head. Are we going home? He murmured, half asleep, and I swallowed, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. Yes, I said gently, my voice softening automatically for him. We are going home. And the words should have settled something in me, should have drawn a line between that night and the rest of my life. But instead, they felt incomplete, like home was no longer the simple answer it had always been. And the drive blurred in that strange way it does when your mind is somewhere else entirely. Traffic lights changing, turns taken without conscious thought, the familiar route unfolding in front of me like muscle memory. And yet every so often, my eyes flicked to the mirror, half expecting to see something that would confirm or deny the feeling that had followed me since I left. But there was nothing, no car. Trailing too close, no sign of him, just the empty road behind me. And still, the sense of being connected to something unseen did not fade. And when I finally pulled into my apartment complex, the quiet felt heavier than usual, the building lights dim, the parking lot mostly empty, everything exactly as it had always been, and yet not. Because as I turned off the engine, the silence pressed indifferently, like the world had shifted just enough that I could feel it, even if I could not explain how. And I sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the wheel, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine, grounding myself in something real, something physical, before I unbuckled and stepped out, moving to the back seat to lift Noah again, his weight warm and familiar against me as I carried him inside, up the narrow staircase, past the same chipped paint and flickering hallway light that had never seemed out of place before. And when I finally laid him down in his bed, pulling the blanket over him, watching his face relax into deep sleep, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. And for a moment, everything felt still again, like maybe I had imagined parts of it, like maybe this was just another long night that would fade by morning. And I turned, heading toward the kitchen, reaching for a glass of water, something simple, something grounding, and that was when I saw it, resting on the small table by the door, something that had not been there when I left, something that should not have been there at all. And my steps slowed, my breath catching as I moved closer, my eyes fixed on the single, small object placed with quiet precision. And when I reached it, my fingers hesitated before touching it, before confirming what I already knew, because there, lying on my table, was a black card, smooth, unmarked except for one line pressed into the surface in clean, unmistakable lettering. And as I picked it up, the weight of it settling into my palm, my heart began to beat louder again, not from fear, but from something deeper, something inevitable, because the words were simple, almost understated, and yet they carried everything I needed to understand. Sebastian Cross. And beneath it, just one sentence written, like a promise that had already been kept. I told you I would find you.